Hi again, and welcome to this week, which we're talking about musical semiotics in popular music culture. What's musical semiotics? What's the usefulness of it? And how might we understand music in relation to it? And why would we be interested in this approach in a course on popular music culture? Semiotics is usually defined as the science of signs, and when that comes from a long history of semiotics, which was developed in language studies, linguistics, and in linguistics, a sign, can be thought of in some sense. There's all sorts of different signs, but words can be thought of as signs. Now, when you try and apply those ideas to music, what you're really thinking about is how to understand how and what music means via a system of signs, if you like. One of the big differences, though, between language and music is, of course, that language can have very specific meanings. So different words can have very specific meanings, like victory, like joy, like phantom, or and the, more common words like those. And those meanings are socially agreed within a culture, and then understood by people who speak that language, particularly in this case, let's say English. Now, in some senses, there have been quite significant problems in musical semiotics, because many previous attempts to understand music have quite straightforwardly taken the language of linguistics and semiotics and tried to apply them to musical sound. One of the really big problems with that approach has been, and this is where we've become unstuck over the years and decades, is that there's a significant difference between language and music, and that is that music is always experienced in time and temporally. And so musicologists have tried to get around this by, for instance, focusing on written scores of music and treating them as objects which we can study for their semiotic significance. But in the end, in real world experience, that is something quite different to language, where one can take a particular word with very specific semantic meaning, i.e. you know exactly what it means in certain given contexts, and music, where meanings are much more emergent. And that's a key issue in understanding the semiotics of music. The meaning of music only really emerges when we're listening or performing it. And so the aspect of time or temporality really comes in a very strong way to understanding any semiotics of music. You could say, for instance, that music is always disappearing because it's always happening in a specific moment, and we are in some senses travelling through it. So musical meaning is not as straightforward in a way as looking at language and linguistic meaning, and time is part of that. But because of this this experience that we have listening to music, one aspect of music that has been studied a lot is narrative, and this sense in which music can tell a story and be understood temporally through time. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, when musical sound is heard in relation to text and sometimes images, let's say, for instance, in a television advert, it becomes much easier, in a sense, in order to talk about the meaning of that multimodal text, i.e. there are sound, image and text all acting together. But the more difficult aspects of the semiotics of music are when, say, instrumental music, we hear that and understanding how that means. And in order to try and cope with that in the 20th century, there were really three main approaches that were developed in the aesthetics of music to try and deal with these issues of music without words, if you like. One approach was what we might call the formalist approach, which is where music was understood and objectified in a very concrete way. And that usually involves writing down the musical score on paper or on a computer, and then analysing it to show just exactly how music as an object has specific meanings and how we understand them as listeners. That's usually understood as a formalist approach, whereby we isolate the meanings in music and set them apart. In the 19th century, that led to a concept that was developed called absolute music. And absolute music is a difficult concept in popular music studies, because what it suggests is a type of music that's completely autonomous, i.e. music that has meaning in and of itself, and only in and of itself, if you like. I'm not sure that any music can be heard as absolute music, and indeed I think even in the 19th century and in the 20th century, absolute music was really a kind of metaphysical ideal, if you like, rather than a real thing which people experienced. But absolute music is an important part of the history of musicology, and an attempt in some senses to specify the meaning of music. But it didn't really work. Another approach that was developed in the aesthetics of music was what you might call the expressionist approach. And this is the sort of position where people think that, music evokes emotion in us, the listener, but doesn't necessarily mean anything in and of itself. Now that's a position, again, that I find difficult to take on board in its entirety, but the expressionist understanding really puts everything onto the listener and how the listener understands music. Another approach is the referentialist approach. Now the referentialist approach is slightly different, because what it says is that music, when we hear it, really imitates or refers to something else in our life experience. So it might be classically in musicology that when we hear music, it sounds sad because it evokes, it refers to something that is sad elsewhere in our experience, like the image of a sad face or a weeping willow tree, for instance. That's a classic example in musicology. None of those three approaches, I think, are really right for popular music culture. And I think the problem with those three approaches is that they're based almost on an individual understanding. And that's where the social semiotics have emerged in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Social semiotics is an approach to understanding meaning that is grounded in people's everyday social understanding of how and what things mean. And in relation to music, what this means, a social semiotics of music, means that the meaning of music, again, is emergent, but there are shared meanings and individual meanings, and these are different things. And so a social semiotics says that, there are shared general meanings that music can evoke, like joy, like loss, like victory, and also that music also, that's particular sounds will have that particular meaning, but layered on top of that, an idea from a musicologist called Nicholas Cook, who says that musical meaning can also have these very specific individual meanings as well. And that might be that when you listen to a song, it reminds you of a certain person, or somebody that's close to you, or somebody that's dead or alive, and that those individual meanings are combined with the socially shared meanings and basically constitute a semiotic world when we listen to music that's very complicated, but yet has certain aspects that we can understand both together as shared social meanings, and also nuanced individual meanings that can be understood simultaneously at the same time.